In a small town named Greentown, in central Indiana, sits the Greentown Glass Museum, and it is packed full of Greentown glass. Today's collectors call it Greentown glass, but that is a little misleading because there was never a factory that was actually called the Greentown Glass Factory. It all began in the early 1890s in a small rural town looking to bring industry into its community. Industry was the key to growing a small town into a thriving metropolis, and as the townspeople looked around, they found that a glass factory would be a natural fit for central Indiana. It took a lot of energy to heat the furnaces to melt the raw materials together to produce glass of all types. In this part of Indiana, in early 1894, natural gas was in great supply, and it wasn't long until factory construction began. The original name of the glass factory in Greentown, Indiana, was the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet Company. In 1899, it was taken over by the National Glass Company, and it became Plant or Factory Number 9, the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet Works. In the museum, you can find a scale model of what the factory would have looked like at the time. Great care was taken to ensure that every detail was as close to the original factory as possible. It was very common to see giant smokestacks rising from the roofs of glass factories. Indiana Tumbler and Goblet was originally built with two main furnaces that were circular in shape and were called pot furnaces. One of the furnaces contained 10 separate glass melting units, while the other held 8. The two stacks are evident in the model. The first expansion to the factory happened in 1897, and it added several additional tank furnaces called roaring gimlets. These tanks took about 18 to 24 hours to melt a batch. In 1898, a 60-ton melting furnace called a continuous tank was added. As its name implies, raw materials are continuously added to the furnace, so the supply of molten glass never runs out. In addition to the furnaces, the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet Factory consisted of a machine shop, which was used to create and repair the molds and other equipment, a warehouse and storage space, cleaning and packing rooms, cooling layers, which allowed the glass to cool slowly so it would not shatter. There was a hay shed and even offices. On the property of the factory was also a cooperage shop. The cooperage shop made the barrels that were used to pack and ship the glassware. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, glass was not shipped in styrofoam and plastic. Instead, it was packed in paper and straw, and it was shipped in wooden barrels. A railroad, the Cloverleaf Line of the St. Louis and Western Railway, ran along the factory. Every time the train would stop at the factory, it would carry away hundreds of barrels and thousands of pieces of glass all around the United States. Some of that glass would even make its way to Great Britain and to Australia. The factory continued to press glass until it burned to the ground on June 13, 1903. The factory was never rebuilt, but the glass products that were made at the factory are sought after by collectors today, and this museum is a showcase for those items. Items made at the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet were pressed. Molds were created by master mold makers and set into a glass press. If you study the patterns long enough, you realize that some of the molds would have taken an extremely skilled artist. While the glass press that is on display in the museum is not originally from the glass factory in Greentown, it is very similar to what would have been used. The molten glass would have been gathered and dropped into the mold by the gatherer. Then a skilled glass presser would pull the handle, which would drop the plunger into the mold. With just the right amount of pressure, for just the right amount of time, a beautiful piece of glass would come from the mold. Various other tools would be used to ensure the pattern and article would meet the expected use and design of the item. The factory produced several colors in both transparent glass and opaque glass. Transparent items allow the light to pass through it, and we can see through that item. Opaque items were not transparent, and you cannot see through them. The museum has a nice display on what various materials would have been used to create the various colors. Most glass would have included the raw materials comprising of silica sand, soda ash, and lime. Then, various other raw materials would have been added to get the desired colors. At the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet Company, they would have most likely used things like uranium oxide to create the canary glass, oats for amber glass, copper oxide for what Greentown collectors call teal blue, chromium oxide and copper oxide for the emerald green color. Greentown's chocolate glass is a little bit of a mystery, but probably included feldspar and fluorspar, and could have even included things like sulfur and possibly even oats. White glass, actually called opal, contained a large number of materials, including bone ash and cryolite. Nile green was a variation of the opal and probably contained iron chromate and other materials. Indiana Tumbler and Goblet made many beautiful colors, but the two that are most famously linked to Greentown are the chocolate and the golden agate, which is often referred to as holly amber. If it were not for the creation and the perfection of those two colors, it is quite possible the factory in Greentown, Indiana would have been shut down several years before the fire. It is also believed that a new color was being tested. However, it seems that only a few test pieces ever left the factory before the fire. A formula has been found for a color called amber rose, and it contains things like zinc and selenium. Today, collectors call it rose agate, and any piece in this color would be exceptionally rare. The first products to come out of the factory were tumblers and goblets, jellies, table glassware, and bar goods, and they were pressed in crystal glass. Packers' goods were items used for food, like baking powder, mustard, pepper, or pickles. Most of the time, these were tumblers or mugs and could have been fitted with tin caps. But evidence also shows that other items, like the various animal dishes, were also used for this purpose. Most factories during this time period produced very similar items, so many in fact that it is sometimes difficult to differentiate the products from the various factories. But there is clear evidence of many of the items that were created in Greentown. As the factory expanded, they began to add colors and tableware lines. Today, most collectors focus on those tableware lines for their own collections. It was common for these lines to include things like a berry set, which would have been a large bowl and several matching smaller bowls, a water set with a pitcher and drinkware, and the table set, which would have included a covered butter, creamer, spooner, and a covered sugar. While these may have been the more common items in the tableware line, it was not unusual for many other items to be created, like compotes, salts, various fancy bowls, and many other items. Greentown glass falls into a category of glass produced from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s called Early American Pattern glass, the key word there being pattern. In the extremely competitive glassware industry, it was very important for glass companies to continue to create newer and more interesting patterns, so people would continue to buy those new items. The first pattern pressed at the Greentown factory was introduced in 1895 and was manufacturer number 11. Today, collectors continue to call this pattern number 11. From the time this first pattern hit the market, the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet Company continued to create new patterns in new colors. In 2019, work began to renovate the Greentown Glass Museum. One of the most exciting updates to the museum is the new layout, and it shows a timeline of the patterns and items produced at the factory. After pattern number 11 came many other patterns, and this included beehive, diamond prisms, shuttle, overall lattice, pattern 75, Austrian, early diamond, brazen shield, pleat band, dewy, herringbone buttress, scalloped flange, teardrop and tassel, leaf bracket, beaded panel, cupid, cord drapery, cactus, invincible, holly, and finally, what most people believe was to be the next pattern to be debuted at the factory, probably in that rose agate color. It's the strawberry pattern. There were also other items produced at the factory, including what collectors now call novelty items. Novelties had various uses and are often exciting items for collectors to find. There is also so much other exciting glass and information to be found at the Greentown Glass Museum, and it is a great place to visit in person. In addition to a museum visit, there are many other places to find information on Greentown Glass, including the National Greentown Glass Association and their junior division. Students can join the junior division and can be included in various events during the year, which includes the annual Junior Glass Auction. Information can also be found online at www.greentownglass.org or in the book Greentown Glass, A Collector's Guide, or as most glass collectors call it, the Blue Book. We would love to say that we already know everything there is to know about items produced at the Indiana Tumbler and Goblet Company, but there are still so many things to be learned. The most recent information learned began in 2019 when an original factory production catalog was found and purchased. A factory catalog was a book or magazine that had a listing of all the items that could be ordered from a factory in a particular year. It is believed this catalog was most likely prepared in late 1902 to be distributed for items that would be available for purchase in 1903. This catalog has provided us with lots of new information that we did not know before. We could always use your help in learning newer and more information about Greentown Glass. You can begin your journey at the Greentown Glass Museum in Greentown, Indiana.